Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar. And this podcast, Working Your Way, is all about how we can show up more authentically in our careers. And while authenticity is great, the point of that is so that we can achieve the things that we want to achieve, and we can do it in a way that actually feels good without all the stress and the struggle and the suffering that can sometimes come along with building a successful career. Authenticity allows us to have that career success that we want in a way that is far more sustainable and just generally better for our well-being. And now I've said on this podcast and outside of this podcast that in order for people to show up authentically, it's critical that they have the right kind of environment to show up to. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So for the next 2 episodes, we're going to focus on that, creating that environment that celebrates and welcomes people's authenticity that they can show up with, and really leveraging it to create amazing results as a team. So I'm going to be talking about this as if I'm talking to those of you who are managing people or leading teams. But even if you're not one of those people, you're not in a position of leadership, formal or informal, I think you'll be able to take away plenty of ideas from these next 2 episodes that can help you in your career or help your team just as a peer or as a resource. So I want to talk about 2 important things that you can do as a leader. 1 is building an inclusive culture on your team, and 2 is creating the conditions for psychological safety. Now, I sometimes talk about creating a sense of belonging in the workplace. It has been a really big part of my own story, and it's a big part of the work that I do. And also, belonging has become this kind of new buzzword that is language that companies might be using around DEI, as DEI is getting politicized and totally misrepresented. They may be throwing out that acronym, bringing in this idea of belonging. But to be honest, I think belonging is a pretty high bar for any leader or company to achieve. And honestly, it's not super realistic for most. And partly that's because we all have to individually feel a sense of belonging. And as a leader, as a company, there's not a lot that you can do to make someone feel a certain way. Part of that is outside of your control. Now, mainly, we all show up to work with our own internal baggage, our traumas, our experiences, our personalities, our coping mechanisms, and all of those things impact our ability to feel like we belong somewhere or not feel like we belong somewhere, regardless of how great a culture or a leader might be. Now, I do work with teams, and a lot of the work that I do does address a lot of this, really from both sides of the coin, both about the environment and those internal blockers, really helping people recognize those things and coaching them through those in both one-on-one and group settings. And I'm always available for a conversation on more hands-on team coaching and things like that. But for these 2 episodes, we're going to focus on the things that you can do as a leader without that deeper level of support. And so today we're going to focus on building an inclusive culture. And in part 2, we'll dive more into psychological safety and how you as a leader or a manager can create the best conditions for that to thrive. So first, let's define what it means to build an inclusive culture. Culture is really nothing more than the ways that you get things done together as a team. It's not really about the extracurriculars or the Slack channels or the happy hours, although those do play a role in culture. It's really more about the day-to-day interactions or the weekly meetings or the way projects get assigned and how you follow up on progress of those projects or how you brainstorm and strategize as a team or how you advocate for what you need as a team, whether it's getting resources from the company more broadly or advocating for what you need from a strategy standpoint, or even just as a culture and as a group and what you need from each other. So culture is rooted in organizations' mission, vision, values, beliefs, right? That's the formal definition of culture. It's this way that those things come to life. But sometimes the mission or the vision or the values is just kind of fluffy stuff that companies put on their websites. And I'm sure that we've all experienced cultures that are something completely different than the values that they state or espouse. But somewhere underneath how things actually operate, you can always actually find the values that that company really lives by. They may just not match up with the ones on the website. And so, what we're talking about today is going to be about creating a culture that underneath that, underneath the behaviors and the ways that everyone is showing up, it stands for inclusion. Inclusion would be a core value that would come to life through an inclusive culture. And this belief that when people feel seen or heard or valued or all of the above, that you actually get a more effective employee and team. So what we're doing today is talking about ways to create that team environment that is inclusive, that does make people feel seen, heard, valued, recognized. And this kind of creating an inclusive culture is a huge topic. It's a huge area. And of course, it encompasses a lot of things that we're not going to talk about today, like people systems, hiring systems, firing system, performance reviews, promotions, and career pathing. All of that stuff plays a role in, is your culture inclusive or not? And very important ones when it comes to understanding equity of who's getting hired and who's getting promoted and how are people getting evaluated in an equitable way. But today we're going to focus on just the actionable things that you can do as a leader within the context of those systems. So what do you actually really have control over in your day-to-day that you could change tomorrow? So my approach to creating that culture on your team where people feel seen and heard and valued is really through understanding your people and knowing what makes them tick, knowing how they best operate, and giving them the tools to understand themselves and articulate these things to you and each other. This is what I do in my business, working with people to understand themselves and then be able to advocate for what they need to bring their best work to the table because they know those things about themselves. This helps you shift the way things actually get done on your team within the world that you can control by understanding your people and what makes them tick. And so it's really about bringing out the individual best of each person on your team and helping build the skill set of the people on your team to create a new level of a collective best as a team. So how do they relate to each other? How do they collaborate? How do they leverage their talents? And so we're not going to necessarily talk about how we give people the tools to do that work today. It is a lot of work that I've talked about in other episodes, in the Enneagram episodes, and really thinking about how do you use the Enneagram as a tool to help your team develop your emotional intelligence. But what we're going to talk about today is kind of three main areas that you, from the vantage point of the leader, can look into and understand and do with your team. So those three main areas are really leveraging the talents of the people on your team, designing for a diverse set of work styles, and managing to the motivations of each individual. So for your people, do you know what their unique strengths are? Do you know what each person is really amazing at? And are you helping them leverage those talents or maybe even aligning future projects or future roles to what they're best at? That second area, designing for a diverse set of work styles, is really about understanding if you know the unique ways that each person takes in information, how they go about solving problems, how they communicate their ideas. And are you thinking about how you can design your meetings or team interactions to enable everybody's best contributions because you know how they operate best? And then that third area about managing to the motivations of each individual, This is really about, do you know what each person really cares about? And do you know what motivates them? And this is really about understanding those intrinsic motivations of each of your people, knowing what brings them meaning in their work and what fills their buckets. And then based on that, you know how to manage them, working with those things and avoiding the triggers that might demotivate them. And so these three questions, right? Do you know, and are you leveraging your people's unique strengths? Do you know the unique ways that each person works best, that enables their best contributions, their best thinking, their best ideas? And do you know what really drives each person so you can manage to that? You can answer these questions by doing a few things. First of all, you can ask them. Now, this may have varying levels of success if you just ask your people, because what often happens is, especially in the corporate world, we don't know ourselves all that well, or we just assume that the ways that we operate are the ways that everybody operates. And so we've never really tried to articulate it. And so certainly you're going to have a group of self-aware people who can tell you exactly what they need. What are their strengths? What motivates them, right? But you can also incorporate a tool. If you need an extra boost and a little bit of help and some language, a tool like Enneagram or a tool like DISC or Clifton Strengths, or there's some free assessments out there on the internet too. There's one called Via Strength. So you can use a tool with your team and have a discussion around that tool that can help them put some language to some things for you. You could hire a coach or a facilitator. That's something that I do all the time, working with people, really harvesting these insights so that they can share them with each other as a team. Or you can do any combination of these things, right? You can ask them, you can incorporate a tool for some things. Maybe they'll know some of the things. You can bring someone in for part of it, any or all. And so I'm going to share a few examples of what it looks like in each of these three areas. And I'm going to use Enneagram types as my lens to look at these three areas. Now, it's just one tool. Obviously, it's my favorite. It's my tool of choice. I talk about it all the time. I use it because it is so effective. And it's just one of many, many tools. And so even though I'm going to speak in the context of these types of, in the framework of the Enneagram, think about your team, and maybe some of this language will spark an insight for you about your people, regardless of if you know their Enneagram types or not. So this first question, what are the unique strengths of your people, and are you helping them leverage those talents? So a couple that I would give you examples of, the Enneagram type 3 is known as the achiever. Their talent is both executing, just getting stuff done, having a goal and figuring out the most efficient path to get there. And they're also really great at what I would call reading the room. That might look like understanding the needs of the consumer or understanding the expectations of stakeholders. And so you can know these things about your people if you have an Enneagram 3 on your team, and maybe have them work with a project manager to find out the most efficient path to deliver the objectives of the team. Or maybe you have them out there really delivering those presentations to stakeholders because they're able to really understand what is going to influence different people and how to tailor a message to different audiences. An Enneagram type 5 they're often called the investigator or the observer. These are systems thinkers. So their strength is really in deep analysis and strategic thinking. They can see a whole system and how all the different parts work together and understand how to make that system better. And so that can be a factory, a piece of machinery, but it also can be a system of some data that you're analyzing or understanding how all the parts fit together in your supply chain and where to make it more effective and efficient. Now, this talent that they have of this deep analysis, they can research and identify patterns and find these really deep strategic insights. Now, in order to do that, oftentimes they are going to need some time and space and some, more resourcing to gather the data that they need to get. We'll talk more about work styles later. But this is something that you can think about for an Enneagram Type 5 is how do you leverage that insights capability, gathering of the right data and finding that insight, finding the pattern, finding the thing that no one else is going to find. And then another one is Enneagram Type 9. So Enneagram Type 9 is called the peacemaker. It's called the diplomat. Their strength is really in harmony, creating harmony. Type 9s are really great at helping teams navigate different perspectives. If there are lots of different data points and thoughts and voices that need to be considered, giving them this information and allowing them some time and space to find what is the common ground, what's the solution that's going to work for everybody, how do we really truly create the diplomatic kind of solution to a problem. They can be great at that, understanding what a team needs, bringing together multiple stakeholders or different audiences. They can be really great at that. I know somebody who is in what I would call kind of consumer insights, and that's a great place for somebody like a Type 9 to be, because they can bring in, okay, we can take this, qualitative and quantitative data and really figure out what it all means together and meet the needs of all of the constituents in the room. Okay, so let's move on to that second question. Do you know how each person takes information in, how they solve problems, how they communicate their ideas? And then can you take that and make sure that you're designing a team environment to enable them to work their way and really bring their best ideas and information to the table, or their best problem solving to the table? So Enneagram Type 1 is the first example I'm going to use. Now they prefer kind of structure, logical thinking. They're called the reformer. They're able to really make everything better. They have these really high ideal standards for how things should be, and they can really find ways to make things better. And so they process information best when there's some structure, when they kind of know what the pieces are. If you're running meetings where everything's kind of discombobulated and all over the place, they may get frustrated because there's a way that things should be done. And so having some structure and having some process that they're able to follow can really help Enneagram Type 1s bring their best thinking or have these clear action steps coming out of things. Now, I'm saying all of these things, and I do want to caveat also that these are the average expressions of the types, right? And so no one person is a monolith. I still would say always, always, always ask your people what they need, ask them what works best for them. And, if they don't know those answers, then invest in a tool or facilitator to come and help you get those. But we can use a tool like Enneagram to understand the most likely thing that people might need. It's just something that we shouldn't always just make assumptions based on a type that you need X, Y, or Z. So the next example I'm going to bring up is the Type 6. Type 6s are called the loyalist. Sometimes they're called the skeptic because they have this really great ability to scenario plan, to see into the future and see around the corner and play out scenarios so that they can find the risks and they can help you mitigate those risks. Now, Type 6s, they process information in a way where they're trying to find some certainty. And so they may ask a lot of questions. They feel safest when they have a lot of context. And so this helps them really assess the risk and find that clarity and be able to play out those scenarios. So if they seem hesitant or if they're asking a lot of questions, it's not because they're challenging you all the time, which we'll talk about in part 2 of this series, but it's because they want more information. They want more context so that they can do what they do best, which is showing the team the way forward, showing them the path that is most certain, that can be most successful or most effective. So if you have a future strategy you're building, having a Type 6 on the team to really assess the risks and help mitigate those can be a really brilliant use of their talents. Now, they want to build some certainty. And so their work style is they're going to ask a lot of questions. They're going to gather a lot of context, but also oftentimes I hear from type sixes that they want a bit more guidance from their managers. They just want to understand, like, what are the boundaries of this thing? Or like, give me some structure and some support and reassurance along the way, and I'll go do my thing. But it's really about, being able to give them a little bit of structure up front or some guardrails around what they're working on. And then having maybe more frequent check-ins that allows them to really bring this amazing problem-solving process to the table. The next example that I have around work styles and what brings out people's best thinking is the type 7. So type 7s oftentimes think out loud and they move really fast. And so type 7s process a lot of information very, very quickly, but they love brainstorming and exploring possibilities like in the moment. And so taking a little bit of time in your one-on-one to like ideate with them, or even having brainstorming meetings where maybe there's a section of it where it's like rapid fire ideas that actually will really help them be energized by the process and get out there like wild and crazy and super innovative and amazing ideas. When something is super structured, they don't always do as well. And so if you want the best from a type 7, having kind of open-ended discussions and creative ideation where they can really think out loud, bouncing ideas around, having moments where you could just like throw stuff up against the wall, not go do anything with it necessarily, but like having that energy reciprocated is really great for them. So those are just a couple of examples of how you can think about what are the different work styles, what are the different problem-solving styles, what are the different thinking styles of the different people on your team. And the idea here is, how do you design an environment that really meets the needs of all of those folks? So you can manage the individual, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second, but you can also create some systems and some processes on your team to allow these things to happen. So one of the things I mentioned was like type 5s and type 9s are people who take in a lot of information. They process oftentimes solo. So a type 5 wants all the data and they have their process of how they put all the pieces together. Type 9s like to gather all the perspectives, and then they need some of that solo processing time. And so for them, unlike the type 7 that I just mentioned, where it's like rapid fire, shoot it out of your mouth in a brainstorm right away, type 5s and type 9s are going to need some time to process. And so thinking about if you're going to have a brainstorm for strategy or a new innovation that you have going on, try to do all of the above. Maybe you publish some pre-reading a day, 2 days, hopefully maybe even a little bit more in advance so that people can take in the information and process. If you're a solo processor, or if you're a longer time period processor and you're an information gatherer, publish that information ahead of time so they can bring their best thinking to the meeting. Now, not everybody's going to need to use that pre-reading or that pre-work. Maybe some people will have ideas right there on the spot. But the idea behind this is, how do we design for the most inclusive way of doing things? And so can you find ways to kind of meet the needs of multiple different types of thinkers? And ultimately, the whole point of this is that you get better ideas and you get better work out of people when you allow them to work their way. And so thinking about, how are you managing folks? How are you designing meetings? All of that stuff is really important. And you can take into consideration how people think, how people process information, how people solve problems to design around those things. If you have questions about how to do those things, I'm always available for calls. It is something that I really enjoy brainstorming with. And oftentimes what I'll do with teams is really look at the makeup of the team. We'll do a workshop. I'll really learn a lot about each person and then really help kind of create some of those systems or processes and understand that with the leader and go and implement those things. Now, this third question is, do you know what each person really cares about and what motivates them? And so this is really about how do you manage to the motivation of each individual. So type twos, as an example, they're called the helper, they're called the giver. They're really motivated by being of service to people, by being needed and being appreciated. So a type two is really deeply motivated by knowing that they're helping people and that they're making a difference. And so if they feel like their contributions aren't valuable or aren't valued or acknowledged, they might become disengaged. They will give and give and give and give without asking for anything in return, but they need to feel that appreciation. They need to feel that connection to the people that they're working with. And so keeping a type two motivated means like following up, like, hey, you did that thing for me. I know you went the extra mile to do this, making sure you're actually following up with that person to say, like, it really made a difference. It meant a lot. It changed the outcome of this thing. Whereas sometimes we're moving so fast, so we're not really circling back with people to help close the loop on how they impacted us, how they helped us. And so a type two is really going to benefit and like be fueled by knowing how their contributions really were helpful. Another thing for a type two, they don't often ask for help and it's not something that they feel comfortable doing. And so knowing that they're motivated by being helpful also means knowing that they have a really hard time saying no to people on taking on more work and things like that. And so as a leader, what you can do is start with a question of like, what can I take off your plate? Or what's the least important thing you're working on, and help them deprioritize that. Not giving them an open-ended question like, how are you doing? Because they're probably going to say, I'm fine. So the next example here, in like knowing how people are motivated, what they really care about, what makes them tick, is the type 8, which is known as the challenger. They're motivated by autonomy and they're motivated by impact. So they're driven by this being independent, being able to do things their way, and this desire to make an impact. And so they can feel stifled if they're being kind of controlled, like having their autonomy taken away, being micromanaged, or having unnecessary like red tape and bureaucracy and processes that don't seem to exist for any reason. And so engaging a type 8 looks like giving them ownership over things and letting them go and giving them decision-making authority, empowering them to be decisive and just move forward on things. Instead of kind of prescribing every detail, like tell them what the objective is and let them do it whatever way that they want to. The other thing too with a type 8 is this idea of impact. They will get really frustrated and demotivated when they're putting in a lot of effort to something that's just like not moving forward. If things are stuck in the system and in the process and that kind of thing, like really, really, really demotivates a type 8. And so you can utilize a type 8 best where there's a lot of kind of entrepreneurial spirit. They can run fast. They can do a lot without a lot of guardrails. And then the last of my examples on my list is the type 4. Now, we don't often find a lot of type 4s in the corporate world, but every once in a while we do. And of course, they exist in so many other amazing spaces. But type 4s are often known as the individualist. And they're really motivated by meaning and authenticity. They're motivated by things having significance. They want to feel connected to their work on a deeper level. They want to really have that heart connection to what they're doing. You'll find a lot of type 4s are creatives, they're artists, they're musicians, they're writers. And so type 4s, if they think their contributions are just kind of generic or insignificant, they could lose motivation. Instead of assigning them work based on kind of efficiency, thinking about really, especially for a type 4, how do I align projects with their personal values, their personal passions, because that will fuel them. Like if a type 4 is in a marketing role, give them some space to really be creative and express themselves in the work that they're doing versus just kind of following a template of here's how you do it, step 1, step 2, step 3, like just, churn out stuff, but really focusing on trying to give them work that feels really meaningful to them. I guarantee you they will put all of that heart right back into that work and create something really amazing. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this episode is barriers to inclusion and understanding what those things could be. And so barriers can be internal and they can be external. So what you're doing or what the company is doing that make people not feel included could be like an example of an external barrier to inclusion. Things like seeing all the women in the organization not getting promoted as quickly as the man, right? Like that is an external barrier to inclusion. It's a system. It's something beyond like that the company is doing that most likely is out of your control. But thinking about that or having a manager, a leader, having you as a leader, not recognizing people's contributions, right? That's an external barrier to inclusion. But the internal barriers to inclusion are things that each of us bring with us as individuals, and there are ways that we hold ourselves back. And so I want to talk a little bit about a client that I had worked with. I mentioned like these things that hold ourselves back. So he was a new leader, very direct, action-oriented leader, a type 8, loves to move fast, loves to take messy action. And we did a team session where a lot of his team members were type 6s, which if you remember are the scenario planners. They want more guidance. They want more support. They want more reassurance. And so you could see how a very direct action-oriented team leader and a team member who's kind of more thorough and wants more guidance and reassurance might have some conflicting natural styles. Not to say they can't come together and figure it out, but the natural inherent way that they just show up without trying doesn't really work that well together. And so all these type 6s on the team, they're really thorough, they're really loyal. They were super loyal to a lot of people throughout the organization. Whenever people would ask for help on things or things to get done, they would always say yes because of that loyalty, because of the dutifulness and the reliability that type 6s really value about themselves. They were kind of overworking themselves. They were overcommitting to stuff that really wasn't even in their scope. And they also had this kind of fearfulness that a type 6 has around like, if I make a mistake or if I drop the ball, I'm going to get fired. It's kind of this like a very dramatic version of like danger. And that exists often. I hear so many type 6s say like, how many times a day do you think about if you're going to lose your job? And most of them say like many times a day. And like, for me, it's just such an interesting experience because it's like, that's never something that I think about or would think about when I was in the corporate world. But this team leader wanted his brand leaders to really take more ownership, not just following direction, right? And like being reactive to what they needed to get done, but to really like lead strategy. And so they're overworked, they're overcommitted, they're doing all this stuff for all these people. They don't want to do the wrong thing or make a mistake. And he wanted them to really take a step back and like start stepping up and start owning things. And so we had this issue where, we sat down, really understood like what were some of the barriers to doing more, to having that thinking time, to really having that like to tapping into their creativity. And we put a couple things in place, understanding the type, understanding how they operate. A big part of it was understanding why they were always saying yes to things and really going through an exercise to eliminate non-value added work and assessing where their scope was creeping, where they were doing things that really weren't even their roles and responsibilities. And so clarifying those roles and responsibilities, having those kind of tough conversations with other parts of the organization to say, hey, this really shouldn't fall on our team's responsibility. And so, how do we either eliminate this or outsource this work or solve it in a different way or move it somewhere else? The other thing that was really important was this idea of creating safety. And how can you create safety for somebody that will allow them to take risks when they may be risk mitigators? They are usually tuned to not take risks. And so the step we put in place was really for the leader to build trust and start to build more trusting relationships. That looks like having one-on-ones consistently and not canceling them. Also over communicating things. So this type 8 leader was very much like, hey, everybody's on a need to know basis. I'm not going to tell you a bunch of stuff that I don't think is important. And for type 6s, context is really important. And so the type 8 leader thought he was doing them a favor by sharing less information, where oftentimes the type 6 will just fill in the gaps of information that they don't know with like doomsday scenarios. And so what the team leader thought was helpful and what actually was helpful were two very different things. Because again, we just as humans like think that other people want what we want or operate the same way that we operate. And so we put some, kind of new processes into place where like, yes, making sure one-on-ones were like very sacred time, that they were connecting, they were building trust, they were using that time to understand each other better, to share more things, and then really over communicating. I'm putting that in air quotes because it seemed like over communicating to the type 8 leader. It was not over communicating to his employees that really wanted more of that context. They even wanted to know when like there was no answer on something. There were a lot of changes going on at the company. And so having just the answers, having more information actually helped create that safety. And so we talked about, as we kind of put these things in place for him as a leader, we talked about like, what would success look like? He's like, how do I know that my type 6s feel safe? How do I know that we have built trust? And that they're no longer kind of overburdened with all of this stuff to do. And my counsel to him was, when your type 6s start innovating, when they start throwing out crazy ideas or taking risks, like, you've hit that mark of one, having the time and space for them to be thinking and doing these things and doing kind of that leadership work in their brands, but two, that you've built that trust and that safety. And the funniest thing was, couple months later, I was meeting with the leader one-on-one, and he came to me and he kind of had like actually a little bit of a complaint where he said, I don't think that my team is really focused on delivering. They're bringing me all these ideas, and I don't think that like the basics are getting done. And so I coached him a bit around this to say like, is the work getting done? Is there what reason do you have to believe that like balls are getting dropped or things aren't getting done or that they aren't delivering on the basics of what they need to do? And he did some reflection on that, and there wasn't anything, but it was such a big shift for him. And in his style of operating, he couldn't see that like, actually, this is what we were working for. This is what we were trying to get to, is that they're taking risks and throwing out ideas and like leading their brands and not bogged down in doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't add a lot of value, or worried about taking those risks or throwing out those ideas because they think that it might, create an issue. So this is really like part of how you create inclusion. It's like, what do the individuals need? What are your blind spots as a leader? We're going to talk about this a lot more in the second part, where we're going to talk about psychological safety, which is this really big buzzword right now. We'll talk about what it is and how you as a leader can really create the conditions on your team for people to feel psychologically safe, and get more into that. But for today, just to wrap it up, like, creating this inclusive culture is knowing your people, understanding what they're really great at, and leveraging those things. Let them go and run with those talents. They will deliver a lot more impact for less effort. Understanding their work styles, having them share with you, giving them some tool to explore this and understand it and articulate it to you and to the rest of their teammates on, how do you do your best thinking? How do you bring your best contributions? What do you need? What conditions do you need for that? And how can we create meeting structures or one-on-one meeting structures, team meeting structures, or work processes that actually allow for that? And then last but not least is what motivates your people. Different people are driven by different things. And how do you both lean into those things, but also avoid the things that are going to demotivate them? So inclusion means having people who feel like I belong here. I have a sense of ownership in my work. I bring my talents and ideas to the table. I'm seen, I'm heard, and I'm valued. So think about those 3 questions. Think about if you know those things about your people. And if not, incorporate a tool, hire a facilitator, have more conversations around those 3 areas so that you can use them to create a more inclusive culture. All right, we'll see you in part 2 for psychological safety.